Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady, and today I've got an oldie but a goodie. Early last year, we got some very exciting news. Two companies had teamed up to go down and scan Titanic's wreck with a type of technology called photogrammetry. Two companies were Atlantic Productions and Magellan, and it gave us some unbridled access, some incredible views of the wreck of the Titanic. We could see some pretty impressive things. BBC News reported on this and they gave some pretty in-depth coverage, and the original video had me commentating that coverage and showing some of the interesting things you might have missed to give you some idea of what the scans meant and kind of what state the Titanic wreck is in. But unfortunately, the video was taken down by an unrelated copyright issue. And then in the intervening months, we had the OceanGate Titan disaster when the OceanGate submersible Titan was lost on the wreck of Titanic, and it just kind of didn't seem like the right time to get this video out. But today, hey, I'm finally excited to be able to show you the original video as it was. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy this look around the incredible scans taken of Titanic's wreck. So the first thing that we get to look at here is a section of the port side of the ship, or the left-hand side, and you can actually see the hull here, and then we're going to fly up and over the top. And already this is telling me a lot of really interesting things. You can see that the boat deck is being basically eaten through slowly. There's a lot of holes appearing all over the deck here, and there's whole sections of it that have actually collapsed. So let's kind of unpack this already. If I just take it back a little bit to the first opening shot here, these are the decks of the Titanic, essentially. So you've got the boat deck, which is the uppermost deck, the A deck promenade, which is the one below it, and then B deck. So these big square windows along here were kind of unique to Titanic in that the Olympic just had those big square windows at the time running the entire length, because on Olympic, this area was just an empty promenade deck where you could go for a stroll. On the Titanic, this huge stretch of promenade was actually replaced by the most expensive and luxurious cabins put on Titanic. Titanic had these, Olympic didn't, which is what contributed to Titanic's size difference to the Olympic. Another big difference between Titanic and Olympic was the fact that Titanic's A-deck promenade, which is up here, was very famously closed off forwards. They kind of late in the ship's construction installed some screens and created a space where first-class passengers could stroll without being subjected to the elements, because remember, that promenade down on B-deck had essentially been deleted. Unfortunately, on the Titanic wreck, because of these scans, we can see that the A-deck promenade has been crushed because boat deck above it has come down like a layer cake, just collapsing. And what's kind of causing this is the fact that this is the very extreme edge of the part where Titanic tore in half. So this is the end of the bow section, the back of the bow section where Titanic actually broke up on the night it sank. This is all collapsed down here. Park Stevenson, who's a maritime researcher and an engineer, has reported back that on some of his findings of other shipwrecks, like the USS Johnston, that damage sustained on the Johnston back in World War II has caused those areas of the ship to decay and corrode and rust away a lot faster. And we can see that on the Titanic, that it's the rear end of the boat deck and getting closer to the tear that bits of the ship are being eaten away. These kind of like pole things hanging down here are stanchions. These would have supported Titanic's boat deck above, and you can see them on the Olympic, but on the Titanic they were plated over. The screens that had the windows on at A-deck have been eaten away by corrosion. This is unfortunate, but these screens, they weren't structural, they weren't made of very thick steel at all. They were really just to kind of like shield the passengers from the sea spray. So it's that kind of thin material that's being eaten away at a much faster rate. This is true of the boat deck as well, so we actually play this little animation real quick. We can see that we're getting now a view over where the Titanic's second funnel would have once stood. This is some of the thinnest metal used on the Titanic, which was around things that weren't necessarily, like I said, structural, so they weren't designed to support heavy loads. So the deck plating especially, we can see there are huge holes here where that's just being eaten away. Interestingly here, we can just see there's a lifeboat davit lying on its side that's just been knocked over. This is really interesting. This is the entrance for the first class grand staircase, and this is the boat deck level, and it's just collapsed. The roof has collapsed, unfortunately. There's a huge hole where the grand staircase dome once would have sat, but all this would have once been the same height as the roof of the officers' quarters over here on the left, so you can see that's just collapsed down. And this is just a mess. The base of the second funnel is really, really badly corroded and collapsed. And that's probably because of the collapse of the second funnel on the night the Titanic sank. Remember, where you see areas of advanced decay where the ship is basically corroding faster, it's probably where it was damaged on the night the Titanic sank. This probably means the second funnel caused quite a lot of damage when it came down. And amongst all this carnage, this looks really bad from up here. You can see things that are really well preserved. So you can see the base of a Scirocco vent fan here. These were the big fans that pulled air down into the ship or pulled stale air out. You can see a big ventilator here that's in basically perfect condition. It looks like that would almost still work if you just kind of like dusted it off. And over here we've got a like really nicely preserved electric winch that would have been used to pull the lifeboats up once they'd been lowered if they needed to retrieve any of the boats. It's just sad that this entrance has collapsed totally. The grand staircase clock, which is so famous from the films and everything, would have sat right here. But fortunately, this has given explorers unfettered access to some of the areas forward of that, because you've got two doorways here, one left and then one right, that lead forward into some of the first class cabins that were up here, and then also the officers' quarters where the ship's officers stayed. This back here is a complete mess. This would have once been the roof of the first class lounge, and that has completely gone. It's gutted, the first class lounge is gone, whatever was below it on B deck, C deck, D deck is just collapsed. So this is very clearly where Titanic lost all structural integrity after the break, and that part of the ship has just gone down and fallen apart. Now we're moving along here to the area just behind the first funnel. And there's a couple of interesting things here that are still really well preserved and other things that aren't so much. So you can see the base of the first funnel. And what's really interesting about this area, this is the first funnel that collapsed on the night of the Titanic sinking. You can actually see there's two layers. You can see this thing here, and then an outer ring. So the outer ring was what was referred to as the outer funnel. I know, very creative. And this is the thing that you see in any photograph of the Titanic. It's instantly recognizable. The White Star buff, that kind of yellowy gold looking color, and then the black band on top. That was the outer funnel. That actually protected the inner funnel, which was actually what was carrying up all the gases and things being expelled from the ship's boilers. That ran really hot, and so that was separated by a bit of a distance. You can see in photographs of Titanic and Olympic's funnels that they have two layers, and you can actually see that still down here on the wreck. Inexplicably perfectly preserved behind the funnel is a water tank that still looks good, while behind that, one of the vents that ran all the way down into the ship's boilers, the roof has collapsed or just been eaten away. What's interesting, and you'll see this a lot around the Titanic's wreck, is that the wood planking is gone. So Titanic's decks were planked in various types of wood. So you had pine and then also teak wood. Teak is extremely solid and will survive a very, very long time on the sea floor. The Bismarck's teak wood decks are all still there. On Titanic, it was often used for margin planking. So that was like the edges of the ship's decking. While the pine wasn't so tough and often got eaten away by microbes first. So you can actually see here that the edges of the deck here, probably teak margin planks, and they're still intact, so that wood is still there. But the planking that would have run along here is long gone. You can see these little dots all the way along. These are the huge rivets or studs that would have held those deck planks in place. So although the timber is gone, you can still see where they would have had these essentially like giant bolts that would have secured them to the ship's deck. You can see the bases of some of the ventilators here. They're all like kind of torn up and badly damaged. What's really interesting is this one down here on the bottom. It looks like it's been unseated, so that's just been completely ripped up and off its base. But you can see around it, some of the concrete base is still there. They actually set these things in concrete on the Titanic's deck. And if you play the game Titanic Honor and Glory, you can load up the demo and you can see that there are areas where there's just concrete, and that's what the ventilators are actually sitting on. And you can very clearly see that here. It's very cool. There was some talk earlier about retrieving Titanic's wireless set. The Titanic's wireless set was below this skylight, and that skylight would have provided fresh air and light straight down into the ship's wireless room. You can see that the roof around it is slowly being eaten away. It's really interesting, this pattern, that it's kind of stemming out from here. This room specifically is actually the machinery room for the ship's elevators. And you can tell because the circular thing here is actually the base of a huge ventilator that would have provided a fresh outflow or inflow of air because the elevators were directly below, and as they go up and down, they kind of create a draft, and you need to be able to get air in and out as they're going. The fact this is being eaten away first from the middle out is kind of interesting. I don't know if this was damaged on the night of the sinking or what have you, but it's just an interesting little pattern. It's sad to say, unfortunately, over here on the right-hand side of the ship, the starboard side, that was once the ship's gymnasium, and that is totally gone. That's just, the roof has collapsed. That's in really, really bad shape. You can see the decks going down. Amazing. This is amazing stuff. You can see the decks going down through the grand staircase, which is really cool. Just have to play that again. The gymnasium just over here, totally gone. That's a little sad. So moving along, we've got the telemotor on the bridge. It's just fascinating seeing the roof here collapsing. The bridge was actually, most of it made out of timber. So that was for the purposes of navigation, so that the compass, which was magnetic, the ship's forward compass wouldn't get confused. A lot of the bulkheads and things were made out of timber, and probably on the night of the sinking, they were badly smashed up and actually broke off, which is why this entire section of the bridge has gone. But you can actually still see the steel coaming, the coaming being the base of the bulkhead or wall that would have once encased the ship's wheelhouse, which is this little room here. You can see that's the steel base that they would have then bolted the wooden planks for the front of the wheelhouse onto. And the telemotor, probably the most famous artifact from the Titanic, is still standing. The ship's wheel, the main helm, steering wheel, would have once been attached to that. And that's the machine that actually hydraulically was linked to the ship's steering engines all the way back at the end of the ship, like 800 something feet away, that would have turned the rudder left or right. I actually did a video on this that you can go and check out called How They Steered the Titanic. Let's see what else we've got. Some of those windows there looking pretty gnarly. They could do with a polish. So this is really interesting. Again, going back to what I was talking about around Olympic versus Titanic switch theory stuff. Very little on the Titanic and Olympic were actually stamped with the ship's names. Some of the life preservers were, but they're long gone. The hull numbers, 400 and 401, were stamped on a lot of components. Olympics was 400, Titanic's was 401. And the resolution of this photogrammetry model is so good that you can pick out the number 401 on the Titanic's propeller blade. So where we are now is back at the stern of the ship. And this is the starboard side, the right-hand side of the ship, kind of looking forward. And it is in bad shape. So this is very clear how poor the condition of the stern section is in relation to the bow section, the front half. This is an absolute nightmare of twisted, broken steel. Okay, a lot going on here. There's a couple of landmarks, which if you're familiar with the Titanic, you'll be able to pick out and say, I know what that is. So, for those of you wondering what it is exactly that you're looking at right now, this is the starboard or right-hand side of the Titanic's rear end, the stern. And it's basically just collapsed and melted down onto itself. This is unbelievable. The windows here, some of those big kind of square windows I was talking about earlier, these, you can just see this little curve, and this is the part that would have curved down to the ship's well deck right at the stern. So that shows us where we are, the well deck being the bit in between where the superstructure ended and the very stern of the ship began. You can see above it the remains of a crane. Now the cranes on the back of the Titanic sat all the way up on A deck. So this tells us that A deck kind of no longer exists here and has collapsed all the way down. Probably the weight of those cranes has just dropped that part of the boat deck down. The absolute level of destruction is really mind-blowing. There's a couple of other little things here that can tell us where we are. Remember I told you about how heavy-duty teak planking is? Well, again, you can see the margin planking around the B deck level here is still there. Wow, okay. There's a lot of things going on here. You can see the remains of the ship's mast. This is the main mast, the one at the back of the ship. The deck house that was sitting on has flattened. So that's collapsed. You can actually just see the two windows from the rear end of that deck house sitting there, where it's just pancaked down. So if we follow essentially where you might have walked, you would have walked out here. So this is all the second class area of the ship. You would have walked out here. You can just make out one of the ship's smaller cargo hatches that would have run down into the second and third class areas. There's that crane we were just looking at. There should be another one on the other side, but it looks like that's just been kind of like blasted off. And in fact, if you were paying attention, you would have noticed we actually just passed it when we were zooming around the wreck, but I'll go back and show you in a second. And then kind of like the only other thing that's recognizable here to me is the top part here of the deck house, which was once the second class entrance. So this would have been the staircase and the elevator machinery that would have led all the way down for second class passengers. It's quite identifiable because of the fact it's got this little kind of rectangular box sitting on top. That was the little machine room that held all of the machinery for those elevators. And that's still standing, but the deck that it's standing on top of, A deck, you can see exactly where that whole level has just gone, collapsed down, and it's a complete mess. From above, it's even worse. Amazing. You can see these big holes are hatches. There are a few spotted around. You can just make out one crane here down on the left, and maybe another one up here. So all these cranes were just basically ripped off the ship, possibly when it hit the sea floor. So what we're looking at here is so hard to make out what we're even looking at. That's kind of like the forward end of the stern section, and this is the very back of the ship down here. And we kind of knew a lot of this stuff. Like, we knew that the stern was in really bad shape. We knew that it had been absolutely destroyed during the sinking, but it's really interesting being able to see it exactly as it is instead of kind of like recreations of parts of it. I've only ever seen Ken Marshall's painting of the stern and some like photo mosaics, but it does not convey the sheer level of destruction. You can see these huge things branching off the sides here. These are, that's essentially the side of the ship. That's the shell plating has just been ripped away and collapsed outward. So you can see the beams that would have once, those are actually the ship's frames, those beams would have once secured the shell plating to the side of the ship. That's the Titanic's ribs have just been ripped out. Meanwhile, down here, the shell plating has been blown out the other way. So what we're looking at there from the top is actually the side of the ship kind of sitting in a little curved shape, gone out like that. Meanwhile, up here, you can see that the deck of the ship's very stern, known as the poop deck, has been blown out and curled around like a tin can. And if we just go back to here, so you can see these lines here, these beams, are actually, these would have once been the roof or the ceiling of the third class smoking and general room. So if you load up Titanic Honor and Glory and go and have a little walk around, you'll see those beams above your head. And now that whole deck has just been flipped up onto its top. This is testament to the absolutely incredible pressures that were put on the Titanic as it was sinking. Just spotted something that's also vaguely recognizable. There's a little ladder here that is also, you can spot that in the Titanic Honor and Glory demo. So this is the basically the level of the well deck. This is where third class passengers would have milled around and socialized. But it's amazing to me that you can see where the center of the middle part of the stern section of the ship has just collapsed down now to almost ground level. You wonder if a lot of this happened during the sinking or over the years. Remember we said that parts of the ship that were damaged during the sinking have been corroding faster. You wonder how much of this was damage from the sinking versus corrosion through the years. It's very interesting here that you actually have the remains of at least 3 cranes, 1, 2, and 3. And I spot over here a tangle of davits. So those would have been the cranes that would have lowered the ship's lifeboats. These cranes, that one might have come from up on A deck. These 2 might have come from the poop deck, which was ripped up and flopped onto its face. It's an absolute mess. It's amazing. You can see the mast here has just collapsed, but it's incredible that it even stayed attached from the ship's plunge to the seafloor. So why does the stern section look so bad? There's a lot of people ask this, and it's really amazing because the front half of the ship, the bow, is in really good condition. Basically, when the Titanic sank, the bow section filled up very slowly with water. It was a nice gradual, it had like 2 hours to slowly settle into the water. The back half of the ship stayed dry. Very famously, it ended up sticking out of the water, and then the ship essentially broke its back because of the pressures involved and the stresses. The bow section had already flooded, so that just kind of sank, dropped like a stone. But the stern section was still kind of floating. It was about 20,000 tons of ship, and most ships at the time weighed between 10 and 20,000 tons. So imagine the stern section is its own ship that suddenly has its front half totally open to the water, and so it just gets pulled down with such force that it hasn't actually flooded yet, and spirals with the jagged end that had broken all the way to the bottom of the sea floor. And because it hadn't yet filled with water, you might have had some implosion stuff going on where these pockets of air, as it's getting pulled down deeper and deeper and deeper, suddenly, instead of exploding, they implode because the crushing depth, the crushing pressure will just cause really serious damage. And you can see it. Again, I'm looking at this pile of metal, trying to pick out literally anything that is recognizable. That's really not good, is it? Again, amazing that we can see this. I really commend the team who've done this, because if this was a 3D model that was accessible to anybody, I'd look at this for hours. The bow section's pretty well photographed and renowned, so I don't think there's going to be a lot that's shocking here as much as the stern section, but this, seeing this massive gaping hole in the side of the ship where the plating's just come apart. That's the exact point where the Titanic hit the sea floor. You would have just had this. You can see its back's been broken very clearly. If we go back to that shot where it's in the stadium, the bow's slanting downwards like that, that should be pointing up by a huge degree. So you can see it's in really, really bad shape. So what does this tell us about what will happen to the Titanic over the next few years and decades? Quite a lot. What's really interesting to me is the fact that the screens of the A-deck promenade have been eaten away. The boat deck has collapsed here. This shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody. The thinner metal is going to get eaten away first. And that's what we're seeing. Now, we already actually saw this on another shipwreck, the Mahino. The Mahino was a twin-funneled steamer that accidentally ran aground while it was being transported for scrapping. And for a long time, it was in really good nick until the 50s and 60s and 70s, when the superstructure, which is all made of that really thin metal, began to be eaten away and collapse. So that was the first thing that went. And we can see that happening to the Titanic right now. Now, the fact that the Titanic is so deep in the ocean means that this is going to take place over a long period of time. Whereas on the Mahino, it happened relatively quickly, just within the span of just a couple decades. The Titanic is very well protected down there, but it is slowly being eaten away. So the first thing that we'll see is all of this stuff, like the promenades, the superstructure up here, that'll be gone. Probably within our lifetime. What's not so easy for the bacteria to eat is the thicker metal. So especially the ship's frames, the ribs of the ship. They are really heavy-duty steel, they're quite thick. The plating, the ship's skin, the outer skin that it's attached to, is thicker than a lot of this lightweight superstructure stuff. So that'll take a lot longer to be eaten away. And you can see it. If you look at the Mahino, over the years, you started to get these holes developing along the ship's side in between where the frames were. So we'll probably start to see that on the Titanic. Maybe not in our lifetime, maybe in 100 years or so. If you go and have a look at the model, have a look at the bow section, there are no holes here. The shell plating's in really good condition. The ship's skin looks fine. But as the years go by, we'll slowly start to see these kind of like Mahino-esque holes appearing in the shell plating. In the end, all that's going to be left of the Titanic probably the ship's frame still sticking up like ribs of a great dead whale out of the seafloor. The shell plating will have gone, all the machinery would have collapsed within the hull. And this is exactly what's happening to the Mahino now. If you look at the Mahino, it's essentially just the ship's skeleton that's standing, and eventually the Titanic will look like that. And after hundreds of years, even the frames will have been eaten away, so that really all that's left of the Titanic will be things like bronze, really heavy-duty metals that are cast in big objects. Like the ship's propellers, they'll last for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. In the end, that's kind of all that's going to be left. Obviously, it's not going to last forever, so it's really great to have this scan now to show us exactly where things are now. Does this tell us anything new about the way the Titanic sank on the night? From what I've seen, we've already gleaned a lot of information, obviously, about the way that the ship sank. This tells me more about kind of where it's at and where it's going into the future. I can easily see this turning into like a Mahino type situation. So there you have it. It's a pretty exciting time, and we'll see more and more of this model, I'm sure, as they show us over the next few months and years, and we'll really get an understanding of what is kind of going on down there on the Titanic wreck and what happened to it. If you learned something new about the Titanic that you didn't already know, or if you spotted something that you have no idea what it is and you'd like me to explain it more, please leave a comment below. I'll see what I can do. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.